And welcome back to the show. New York is home to one of the largest and most diverse immigrant communities in the United States. Its threats to immigrants' well-being and rights have increased in recent years, whether due to the cruel deportation agenda of former President Trump's administration or local anti-immigrant ordinances. New York has especially been impacted. Our next guest is Policy Counsel at the ACLU, whose work focuses on state and local policy, as well as legislation to protect the rights of immigrants, including policies which disentangle local authorities from immigration enforcement. Here now to share a little bit more, we're pleased to be joined by the Policy Counsel of ACLU of New York, Ahmad. And Zach, good to have you.
Hi, good to be with you.
Thank you for being with us. And as we did say at the top of the lead of the segment, that we do have a very diverse community here in New York, more so than anywhere else in the United States. But when we talk about what we're seeing with regards to immigrant rights, a lot of people still not satisfied. So give us a little bit about the work that you're doing right now with Boots on the Ground.
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we're trying to do in the legislature this year. So in recent years, the legislature has done a number of things to protect the rights of immigrants. It's made driver's licenses available regardless of immigration status. Last year, the legislature passed a bill that helps keep ICE out of our courthouses. But there's still a lot more that the city could do to make sure that people's due process rights are being protected, and that people are free from, or people at least, have the confidence to know that their state and local government is not conspiring with ICE. And so that's what the bill that I wanted to talk a little bit about today would do. It's called the New York for All Act. And what this bill would do is it would ensure that state and local authorities, including law enforcement, are not using their resources, their time on duty, to conspire with ICE and to help funnel people into ICE custody and put them down the path for deportation. So it would make sure that people's information is safeguarded. It would make sure that people who are in custody know their rights if they are interacting with ICE. It would make sure that law enforcement officers aren't telling people if someone is in jail when they're being released, so that ICE can come pick them up. It really follows the lead of what other states have already done, most notably California and Washington, and what certain places both in New York and outside of New York have done at the local level. Here in New York City, we have some laws that put in place some boundaries between how the city and the state can conspire, or how the city rather can conspire with ICE. But as you move across the state, there's kind of a patchwork of local laws, and in some places there are no protections at all or no policies at all to speak of. And we know that that local law enforcement does work hand in hand both with ICE and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which operates Border Patrol. So this is a law that would make things consistent across the state. And while it wouldn't solve every problem that immigrants are facing, it would make sure that that New York is not participating in a cruel and misguided federal immigration enforcement regime.
And you talked about how other states have already adopted policy. What have you heard so far out of New York in regards to embracing this?
So I think there's a lot of support and eagerness to put this kind of thing in place in New York. There have been bills in the past that have passed the Assembly to do very similar things. This bill is a little bit more robust in terms of the protections it would provide than what's been done in the past. And as I mentioned, the legislature has already taken several steps, such as making driver's licenses available or making sure that ICE is out of our courthouses. Governor Cuomo has issued a few executive orders that apply specifically to state employees. So I think there's a lot of indication that New York is ready to embrace these kind of policies. It's just a matter of making sure that they're consistent across the state, and that's what this bill would effectively do.
Yeah, and so we talk about the bill. Where does it stand now?
Sure. So the bill has been introduced in both the New York Assembly and the New York Senate. Assemblywoman Reyes from the Bronx is the sponsor in the Assembly, and Senator Salazar from Brooklyn is the sponsor in the Senate. We're working to get it pushed through, and hopeful that we can pass it this year. You know, there are new people signing on, new lawmakers signing on to the bill each day as they continue to hear more about it. And so we're pushing, and we're both educating members of the assembly and also educating communities across New York about what the bill would mean for them, and making sure that everyone knows what the opportunity is here to pass this legislation.
Give our viewers some perspective on this as you talk about the law. We know that a lot of families have already been impacted and affected by this. For someone who may not know and say, listen, you know, why this is important, give us a little bit of, you know, some background in terms of some family stories possibly that you can share with us about the impact it's had.
Sure. Well, I'll speak a little bit more generally, but what I'll say is that ICE, over the course of its existence, since it came into existence in the early 2000s, has really built its enforcement structure on the backs of local law enforcement. So something that we hear about regularly, particularly in regions upstate and often in border regions, are examples where someone will say, be pulled over for a very minor traffic offense, maybe like a broken tail light or something, and then at that point they'll be profiled, and an assumption will be made about their immigration status. Questions will be asked about their immigration status, and if the police officer is conducting that stop believes that person might be undocumented, that might result in a call to Border Patrol or ICE, the local field office, and then that will lead to someone coming onto the scene and that person ending up in ICE custody because of the actions of local law enforcement. And there are different variations of that you see across the state. Now, state law already prohibits people from being held past their release date. If someone is in custody, if someone is in jail, they can't be held longer than they otherwise would be, so that ICE can come pick them up. But what's not clear under the law is whether or not, or it's not clear under the law that ICE cannot be told of when a person is being released. So that's another thing we see across the state. Our local jails informing ICE about when a person is being released from custody, and then ICE will show up at the jail and take that person into custody and essentially enact a double punishment on that person, who, in addition to the consequences that they're already subject to under the criminal legal system. So this is something that happens in New York City. It's something that happens in the suburbs in Long Island and Westchester, and even more so as you spread out across the state and you have fewer policies in place. So what this bill would do is it would take away that piece of it. It wouldn't allow ICE to build its enforcement structure on the backs of local government. It would make sure that New York is not participating in that kind of cruelty and not helping separate families.
Right. And we hear the stories of separate families all the time. And, the question gets into when does a lawyer allowed to enter into the fray? And so I know that there's a component about right to a lawyer. Talk to us about right to a lawyer. When does those who are being affected like this have a right to a lawyer?
Yeah, so someone who's in immigration proceedings or is being confronted by ICE or being asked questions by ICE absolutely has a right to a lawyer. But one important thing to note is that currently, unlike in the criminal system, a person who is in deportation proceedings doesn't have the right to a lawyer at the government's expense. While we do have programs in the state and particularly in the city that allow people to get that kind of representation through city funding and state funding that's been made available, there's also a bill in the legislature that would make that kind of right absolute and guarantee that if someone is in deportation proceedings or in removal proceedings, that they have a right to not only a right to have a lawyer, but a right to have a lawyer that the state of New York will pay for. That's called the Access to Representation Act, and that's another bill that we're pushing for. What the New York for All Act would also do is it would make people aware that they have that right at critical moments. Specifically, there's a part of the bill that would require that people who are, say, in a local jail, they've been arrested perhaps for a very minor offense, and they're being detained in local custody. Under the New York for All Act, they would be given information about what their rights are in interacting with ICE, including their right to remain silent and including their right to contact a lawyer and have counsel with them if they choose.
Yeah. So for people who want to be on board in terms of supporting the movement, supporting the work that's going on, how can the public be a part of this, about this engagement?
Yeah, there are a lot of opportunities for the public to engage. We've been holding community conversations across the state. The NYCLU has, in partnership with some of the other organizations we're working for. Those are open conversations for people to come hear more about the bill, perhaps share their thoughts and experiences with immigration enforcement if they choose. And there are a lot of things that people can do. They can call their lawmakers and urge them to pass the bill. They can educate their own neighbors about the impact that ICE's enforcement has had on their communities and why New York shouldn't be a part of it. There are any number of things that people in the community can help do to put this across. And there's more information on our website and links that people can include to get, or that people can click and get onto lists where they can keep abreast of the developments that are happening and become more involved in the campaign.
What are some of the biggest challenges you're facing right now in the work that you're doing?
There are a lot of challenges that I could speak to, but perhaps one thing to speak to is I think a sense of complacency, not from all, but from some, about what the new administration means for immigration enforcement. The Trump administration, I don't think I have to tell people, was a particularly terrible time for immigrant communities, and really saw ICE enforcement ramped up to a degree that we haven't seen before. And we now have a new president who has promised a different approach to immigration enforcement, but there's a lot we still don't know about what new federal policies will be more permanently, what impact they're going to have, and how they'll differ from what we've seen in the past. I would like to remind people that even under the Obama administration, we saw more deportations than under any president prior to that. So, this is something that is a system that's in place. It's not something that's it's not something that's going to change simply because new people come in and might try to put in place a more lenient approach. And so that, I think, is one challenge now, is reminding people that, what we've seen over the past years is part of a system, and part of an especially cruel system, and a system that's designed in a way that is not built to protect the rights of immigrants. And we need to be vigilant about that, going forward, and not take for granted that things are going to change just because we've had a change in administration.
Yeah. Amidst the pandemic, we now know that vaccines are continuing to roll out across the United States. Many now are seeing record numbers of vaccines hitting their hometown. Talk to us a little bit about in the jails and ICE facilities about vaccine distribution. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so that is an ongoing issue, and we're trying to find out more about what the federal government's plans are and what the state's plans are to vaccinate people who are in ICE custody. Here in New York, we have a large federal immigration detention facility in Batavia, New York. That's federally owned and operated, but it exists in New York. And then in Orange County and a few other places, there are people who are in local jails who are in ICE custody, but are physically in the custody of those local jails via contract. And there's a lot we're trying to learn about what the vaccination protocols are for those populations, and a lot more answers that we want. I think we're not satisfied so far that either ICE or the state has put forth a meaningful plan to vaccinate people who are in ICE custody, and that should be a priority. We know that COVID-19 is particularly threatening in congregate care settings, and particularly in jails and prisons. And so, we should know a lot more than we do now about how ICE and the state, to the extent it's involved, what they are doing to make sure that those people are vaccinated and are being protected.
Yeah. How has COVID-19 impacted the ICE facilities from what you can tell us?
Well, there have been outbreaks at ICE facilities, not just in New York, but also in New Jersey, across the river, where many New Yorkers who end up in ICE custody are detained. And it's been a huge issue since the beginning of the pandemic. There have been large outbreaks. There has not been a sufficient response to that. There have been calls by advocates, including ourselves, to release people who, particularly people who are vulnerable to COVID-19, people who are elderly or who have underlying conditions. And ICE has not done that to the extent that's satisfactory. So just as COVID-19 has been deadly in jails and prisons across New York State and across the country, it's had a similarly disastrous impact in ICE detention facilities.
So for people who want more information, we know that they can get connected to seeing local news and local media. Is there a petition that's being circulated? Is there anything else that's going on in terms of gathering more public support for the work that you're doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of information available on our website. That's nyclu.org. If you go there and you click on the Immigrants' Rights section, you will be directed to a lot of information about the litigation that we're involved with around immigrants' rights, as well as the New York for All campaign, and how people can get more involved in that and try to address this from the state and local level. There are also organizations we're working with, like the New York Immigration Coalition and the Immigrant Defense Project, that have a lot of information available about that people can both educate themselves with and things that they can plug into to take action. So there's a lot out there, and I'd be happy to provide more of that information. So perhaps you could provide it to your viewers. But there are many, many ways for people to get involved, and there are also opportunities. I've talked a lot about kind of what's going on in New York State and in New York City and at the local level. But there are a lot of opportunities to also advocate at the federal level. Call your congressional representatives, call the Biden administration, make sure that they are hearing your voice and what people want in terms of a new and more humane immigration system going forward. So yeah, there are a lot of petitions. There are a lot of action opportunities, and I'd be happy to provide more information on that so you can provide it to your viewers.
All righty. Well, Zach, we're going to leave it there, and thank you so much for joining us. And certainly we'll continue to update our viewers on New Yorkers for All and all the work that you guys are doing at the NYCLU. Thanks much.
Thank you.
All righty. Zach Ahmad, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums.